The blockade was already active when a Venezuelan tanker slipped beyond the edge of the map. Its signal did not fail, and it was not intercepted. It continued moving, fully loaded, while every system designed to monitor it showed nothing. By the time analysts reconstructed its path using satellite imagery, the ship was days closer to Asia and beyond practical reach. What mattered was not the oil on board, but the realization that a naval cordon had been crossed without resistance, without confrontation, and without a single visible mistake. Since the beginning of January 2026, oil tankers the size of floating skyscrapers have vanished mid-voyage. Bloomberg reported late last year that roughly a dozen vessels loaded with Venezuelan crude abruptly disappeared from standard satellite tracking systems after clearing port. One moment, they appeared as steady signals carrying millions of barrels. The next, they were gone, not sunk, not seized, just erased from the map. The disappearance has nothing to do with advanced stealth or secret technology. Every modern tanker carries an AIS transponder, a safety beacon required by international rules that broadcasts identity and location. When crews shut it off, the ship stops speaking to the digital world. A 300-meter vessel keeps moving, but on screens, it becomes a void. To satellites that rely on compliance, the ship no longer exists. According to tanker tracking data reviewed by Reuters earlier this year, an estimated 10 to 12 million barrels of Venezuelan crude have traveled this way in just a few months. At prevailing prices, that oil represents billions of dollars in revenue, moving despite a blockade explicitly designed to prevent it. Each successful journey turns enforcement into a guessing game rather than a certainty. The reason the risk is worth taking lies beneath Venezuelan soil. The country holds the largest proven oil reserves on Earth, exceeding Saudi Arabia and Russia, a fact confirmed repeatedly by OPEC and the U.S. Energy Information Administration. More than 300 billion barrels remain underground. For Caracas, that reserve is not an abstract statistic. It is the only source of hard currency capable of keeping the state functional after years of hyperinflation, shortages, and isolation. For the United States, restricting access to that oil has always been about leverage. Sanctions were meant to starve the government of revenue and force political concessions. Naval enforcement escalates that logic, turning financial pressure into maritime control. Whoever controls the exits controls the timing and value of the resource itself. When tankers go dark and reach open water anyway, the strategy begins to fracture. Every barrel that escapes is not just income for Venezuela, but evidence that possession of the resource still confers power, even when markets are officially closed. The ships carrying that message are not pristine. They are often aging tankers purchased cheaply, reflagged multiple times, and owned by chains of shell companies registered in jurisdictions designed to disappear under scrutiny. Crews are paid in cash. Documentation is temporary. Communications move to encrypted channels the moment tracking stops. The strength of the system lies in its opacity, not its sophistication. Venezuela did not design this playbook. It borrowed it. Iran has relied on shadow shipping networks for years to move oil under sanctions. Russia expanded similar methods after Western restrictions tightened following the invasion of Ukraine. The Financial Times reported by mid-2023 that these fleets had grown so large they were reshaping global tanker markets. Venezuela simply plugged its crude into an existing underground logistics system. That connection changes the confrontation. What began as U.S. pressure on Caracas now runs into a transnational gray market that evolved specifically to survive American enforcement. These tankers are not wandering. Shipping data compiled by Reuters shows that most Venezuelan crude moving through dark channels ultimately reaches China, often after ship-to-ship transfers that obscure origin. From Beijing's perspective, the calculation is cold and practical. China is the world's largest oil importer. Energy security has been a national priority since earlier price shocks exposed how vulnerable growth could be to supply disruptions. Venezuelan crude, discounted because of sanctions, offers volume and leverage. Each shipment adds another source beyond the Middle East and Russia. There is also influence embedded in the trade. By continuing to buy when Washington applies pressure, China deepens its position in Latin America without deploying soldiers or issuing threats. Analysts cited by the Wall Street Journal have described this approach as power through dependency. A government that relies on Chinese demand for survival has fewer incentives to align fully with U.S. objectives. That reality lands directly on the deck of a U.S. destroyer. Imagine detecting a tanker visually or on radar, its transponder silent, its ownership unclear. Boarding it in international waters risks violating maritime law without airtight evidence. Seizing it escalates a sanctions dispute into a diplomatic confrontation. Now add intelligence suggesting the crew or flag is Chinese, or that the cargo is destined for a Chinese refinery. At that point, the decision stops being tactical. It becomes strategic. Intercepting the ship risks retaliation far beyond the Caribbean, across trade, finance, and security channels. Former U.S. naval officers speaking to the New York Times last year acknowledged this constraint openly. Enforcement at sea is limited less by firepower than by consequence. Every action carries political weight, and rivals understand how to amplify that cost. That hesitation is the opening the shadow fleet exploits. The result is a structural split in global energy markets. One system operates through transparent contracts, insurance, and compliance. The other moves through discounts, secrecy, and political risk. As more oil flows through the latter, reversing the trend becomes increasingly difficult. The response has been quieter, but, relentless. When AIS signals disappear, surveillance does not stop. Intelligence agencies rely on synthetic aperture radar satellites capable of detecting large metal hulls, regardless of weather or darkness. Unlike transponders, radar does not require cooperation. It simply observes what exists. Commercial firms working with governments, described by Bloomberg in recent reporting, combine satellite imagery with machine learning models to identify suspicious movement patterns. Financial investigators trace payments through intermediaries and unconventional settlement routes. Port authorities receive discreet warnings about specific vessels. The game adapts. Ships loiter near congested lanes to blend in. Transfers happen at night. Ownership structures multiply. Each successful run teaches the fleet how to stay ahead. The pressure does not stop at sea. Behind the blockade sits an equally aggressive financial campaign designed to suffocate Venezuela's oil trade on paper, even when barrels physically move. U.S. Treasury officials under Secretary Janet Yellen have expanded secondary sanctions targeting insurers, shipbrokers, and payment intermediaries that touch Venezuelan crude. According to reporting by the Wall Street Journal earlier this year, even firms with indirect exposure now face scrutiny, forcing insurers in Europe and Asia to quietly exit tanker coverage tied to Caracas. That retreat has reshaped pricing. Traders interviewed by Bloomberg in recent weeks said Venezuelan crude now trades at some of the steepest discounts in the global market, sometimes $20 to $30 below benchmark prices. Those losses are real, but so is the trade-off. Discounted oil that still sells is preferable to reserves trapped underground. For buyers like China, the math is irresistible. Inside Venezuela, President Nicolas Maduro has turned the survival of these shipments into a political weapon. State television regularly frames successful exports as proof that U.S. pressure is failing. Officials close to PDVSA, the state oil company, told Reuters that export logistics are now treated as national security operations, with routing decisions handled alongside military planning rather than commercial scheduling. Washington is not blind to the implications. Former U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin acknowledged in congressional testimony last fall that maritime enforcement against sanctioned states now operates under tighter political constraints than during earlier eras. He avoided naming Venezuela directly, but lawmakers pressed repeatedly on the risk of incidents involving Chinese-linked vessels. The message was implicit. Escalation management now outweighs interdiction. Beijing, meanwhile, has kept its public posture deliberately calm. The Chinese Foreign Ministry has avoided direct references to Venezuelan oil shipments, instead reiterating that China opposes unilateral sanctions not authorized by the United Nations. That language matters. It provides diplomatic cover while leaving commercial actors free to operate. Analysts at the Financial Times have noted that this ambiguity allows Beijing to benefit materially without formally challenging U.S. naval actions. There is also a currency dimension beginning to surface. Some Venezuelan oil payments to Chinese entities are now settled outside the dollar system, using intermediaries and alternative clearing mechanisms. While volumes remain small, IMF economists have warned in recent working papers that sanctioned trade increasingly bypasses traditional dollar channels, slowly eroding the reach of U.S. financial leverage. The broader signal is unmistakable. Sanctions no longer function as a binary switch. They create friction, not closure. Each workaround becomes a template, and each successful delivery teaches others how to replicate it. What began as an effort to isolate Caracas is now feeding a wider ecosystem that thrives on fragmentation. The United States Navy still dominates the seas, but the contest has shifted away from visible force toward legal thresholds, financial plumbing, and political risk tolerance. That shift favors actors willing to operate in ambiguity. Venezuela's oil is moving not because the blockade is weak, but because the world around it has changed. And that change is accelerating, one silent tanker at a time. For Venezuela, the benefits are immediate and existential. IMF assessments released with its latest regional outlook show modest improvements in foreign currency inflows despite sanctions. That money translates into imports of food and medicine, wages for soldiers, and the basic functioning of the state. Survival, not prosperity, is the objective. There is also a psychological shift. Being able to sell oil under a naval threat undermines the narrative of isolation. It signals resilience at home and leverage abroad. The government can point to partnership with China as proof that pressure failed to break the state, only to redirect it. This partnership does not require treaties or ideology. It rests on barrels and payments. That makes it durable. What unfolds in the Caribbean is not a victory parade, but a warning. Naval supremacy remains real, but its effectiveness erodes when opponents exploit legal gray zones, global commerce, and rival interests. Control of sea lanes does not guarantee control of outcomes. Smaller states are watching. By offering resources rather than alignment, they can attract tolerance or support from major powers seeking advantage elsewhere. Pressure shifts from force to calculation. The shadow fleet is not just moving oil, it is exposing the limits of enforcement in a fragmented world. And as those tankers vanish from screens and reappear half a planet away, they leave behind an unsettling reality. The blockade exists, but so does everything that slips past it. Please like and subscribe. Leave your thoughts in the comments. Your support helps us grow. Thank you.